Hello, I'm David Kerr, Director of Communications for the Diocese of Lansing, and tomorrow, May the 1st, is the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker. It's a relatively new feast in the calendar of the Church, instituted only in 1955 by Pope Pius XII in order to counter, as he saw it, widespread but erroneous misunderstandings as regards labour and work, and also to promote Catholic social teaching. But what is Catholic social teaching, I hear you ask? Well, to discuss that, I've been joined by Kishore Jayabalan. He is most notably a son of Flint in the Diocese of Lansing. He was raised in a secular Hindu household, but later in life was received into the Catholic Church by none other than Pope St. John Paul II, and went on to work under Pope St. John Paul II for the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, whose job it is to promote Catholic social teaching. I began by asking Kishore, though, to tell us a little bit more about tomorrow's feast day.
So the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker came about in 1955 with Pope Pius XII, which was very much meant to, substitute for the May Day celebration. So the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker on May 1st. May Day had been celebrated pretty much around, definitely in Western Europe and pretty much, I think, in most parts of the world, except the United States, as a feast of the worker, right? Of the working classes. It started certainly by the American Federation for Labor in the 1880s, had proposed limiting the workday to 8 hours. And this had led to the commemoration of May 1st, because this was the day on which they wanted the 8-hour workday to start when they were proposing it. May 1st was the day in which this was commemorated, and it went from there to an introduction to let's call it the International Labor Organization. It became eventually a day on which kind of general strikes were planned to not work, to protest, let's say, unfair labor conditions, whatever it may be. Then eventually became a great rallying cry for socialists and communists. Now, of course, this is during post-Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union, which had proposed to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, or the working class. So the Soviets then make this let's call it a pseudo-holiday, because they were really protesting against no one but themselves, and they're supposed to be in charge. So ultimately, this becomes a great communist feast day on May 1st. And with the condition of the working classes being of great concern also to the Catholic Church, and not just to communists and socialists, Pope Pius XII decides to establish the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker on May 1st, which is why we also celebrate it in the Church. Now, it's also meant to contrast, I would say, the visions of human work, the Catholic vision or the Christian vision with the socialist or communist vision. There's some major distinctions, of course, and holding up St. Joseph as a model, I think, is very useful to make these distinctions. So if we look at the life of St. Joseph, first of all, his holiness, right, is most important. His closeness to our Lord Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary made him the most holy person probably who ever lived. He must have felt very daunted by this, being the only one who was capable of sinning in his family. But at the same time, he was very much sanctified by their presence. We say that Saint Joseph died a most holy death because he would have died in the presence of Jesus and Mary. And so really the key point to remember about Saint Joseph, the worker, or the earthly father of Jesus, or the husband of Mary, no matter what we want to qualify him with, is that he was close to Jesus and Mary. That is what makes everything he does holy. So it's not work per se that makes him holy. It's certainly not his, let's say, supposed membership as a member of the working class or the proletariat that makes him holy. And it's certainly not necessarily that he was a good craftsman or carpenter, as some people call it, or even what he produced. Right? It was really his sanctity that serves as the model for us. There are things that we know. Of course, we know that St. Joseph doesn't speak in the Gospels. He's silent, but he is also very much obedient to God's will. And this, of course, is the most important part about holiness as well, the most important aspect about holiness. So really from 1955 on, we celebrate May 1st as St. Joseph the Worker. Of course, St. Joseph also has another feast day on the calendar, March 19th, as a universal patron of the church. John the 23rd included him in the canon, right, for the Holy Mass. Popes prior to Pius XII also recommend that we go to Joseph. For the Litany of St. Joseph, there's one that's been established. Joseph as universal patron, as I mentioned before. So really, St. Joseph has been a model for Christians for a long time. But really, the cult, I think, formally gets all the way with this feast day in 1955.
How would you describe you spoke about the Catholic view as regards work. How would you describe, what is a Catholic, I mean, obviously you may want to compare and contrast it with the communist view we've just spoken about, or even a more contemporary, postmodern, Western, slightly hedonistic view of work, which is that work is a drudge, is a burden. We live for the weekend. We count the days down to retirement. What compare and contrast, if you like, but what's the Christian vision of work?
Sure. So the Christian vision really starts with creation, right? We learn from the first book of the Bible, from the book of Genesis, that the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, to subdue and dominate the earth, those are some of the first commandments that God gives to Adam, right, to man, at the very beginning. So it's not so much, even before sin exists, right, even in the Garden of Eden, let's say, man is called to cooperate with God's creation, with God's work. As the peak of creation, right, and he's made in the image and likeness of God, he has a special responsibility. We often call that stewardship over creation, right? That's what we mean by subdue and dominate. Dominate, not coincidentally, right, means to lord over, right? To dominate, not necessarily to abuse, as we like to think of it maybe in our more secular age, but to lord over, to exercise responsibility, to care for creation, to bring it out its best, right? And so God very much from the beginning wants us to cooperate with his creation. He didn't create us to simply sit back and be idle in creation, right? To, again, as I said, to kind of even to do things like farming and things, right? To till the garden, to work. Work only becomes toilsome or burdensome after the fall of man, right? When it comes with original sin. So work by itself is a good thing that God commands us to do. It's also very much tied with propagating the human race, right? With having children, having a family environment, right? Adam and Eve. Eve is created, of course, as the best partner for man. It's not good for man to be alone. So marriage is instituted very early on in human history, again, before sin. These are things that are not concessions to sin, but really a fulfillment of God-given human nature. And so this is really in a very too short summary, the Christian view of work. Now, if you contrast that with the socialist or communist view, right, which is that there are permanent classes in society, especially post-industrial revolution. The communist is very much a historic view of man. That post-capitalism, there are societies divided into two, between capital and labor, between, let's say, bosses and workers. And I think anybody who's worked in a office or factory understands that division very clearly, including the Diocese of Lansing, that there are, there are kind of office dregs and drudges, and then there are people who call the shots. So the communists take that class distinction and make it permanent, and make that conflict that all of us have lived to some degree at some time or another, and say that this is the way society always is. And what really needs to happen for the full liberation of man is that we need to expropriate the expropriators, is the Marxist language, right? To take the reins of ownership away from the few capitalists, right? Who are always trying to drive down wages to increase profits and things and exploiting workers, and really establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, put the working man on top. And the communists were not the only ones, of course, to think like this. All kinds of populist movements and political movements, because there are so many more workers than capitalists, it's always a very popular thing to do. But to overthrow society, right, to upend society, to put the many in charge of the few and take away private property, for example, and to think that we achieve some kind of new consciousness as human beings if we change capital labor relations. This is the communist view. And of course, the Soviet Union was the earliest and most, let's call it, infamous example of what happens when you establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, which ends up being, of course, a dictatorship of the party, one party, in the name of the working class, where everything becomes subsumed to work. Everything becomes subsumed to the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat, to the point where May Day, right, in the Soviet Union became a great occasion. It was supposed to be a celebration of the working man, but it really became a celebration of the Soviet military, because this was going to be the great tool in which the Soviet empire liberates the rest of the world. And you would see with Stalin and his successors, they would watch these huge military processions. This was anything but a celebration of the working man, as anybody who noticed it. And even the Soviets looked at it as a joke themselves. But this is what happens when you have a very class-based, conflictual understanding of work and labor relations, an ideological vision. On the other hand, there's, let's call it the more liberal, classically liberal or liberal democratic capitalist view of work, which is very much grows out of the Enlightenment. Philosophers like John Locke, who proposed a different type of, let's call it, state of nature or Garden of Eden, in which divine providence plays very little role. It's all up to human ingenuity and human effort to improve creation. Really, creation means nothing, right? Nature is barren without human effort. And so let's call them the capitalist vision of human work and society is it's all human effort. It's not so much about a class system, but an entrepreneurial system, let's call it, right? One where the most talented, the most ambitious, the hardest working will drag the rest of us through their ingenuity into the uplands of progress. And that's very much, I would say, the system we live under in the United States. It's not the only influence, of course, on American life, but the kind of Enlightenment Lockean view is that nature produces very little by itself, and it's only through the liberation of human energies that we can flourish. So both the socialists and the liberals have very little room for God or divine providence, and can ultimately lead to subjecting human beings to work. That really that work becomes everything, and that there's nothing necessarily redemptive or pleasing to any providential or all-knowing, all-caring God. So those are really some of the alternatives that the church is kind of proposing to the way the world thinks about human work.
You obviously speak with some authority in these matters, being a former official at the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. You're also, I guess, even more notably, a son of the Diocese of Lansing and a son of Flint. How did you find your way or make your way in terms of one's life journey from Flint to Rome.
To Flint to Rome and back to Flint. So I was actually born in Chicago, so I wasn't born in this great city of Flint. But my father was a medical doctor, so he did his residency in Chicago. So he and my mother and my younger brother, who was also born in Chicago, moved to Flint when I was, let's say, 3 or 4 years old. I'm not sure the exact month. And pretty soon, when it was time for me to go to kindergarten at school, we were living in Swartz Creek, so just outside of Flint. And my mother was very taken with Father Wishmeyer, who was the pastor of St. Mary Queen of Angels, which had a school. And my parents, who were not Catholic, decided to send me to school there. And so I ended up enrolling in kindergarten. I think I was the only non-Catholic, certainly the only non-Christian in our very small class. I don't think we were more than 15 children. So I started to learn about Catholicism at a very young age in a formal setting in schools, and continued with Catholic education all the way through high school at Powers. And so basically all my friends were Catholics. I was used to going to Mass. I was a Catholic fan, but not yet a Catholic. And after some time at the University of Michigan, where I did my undergraduate, and then in Washington, D.C., working for the U.S. government, along with some friends, we were talking about Catholicism, and it was really part of my background. A friend of mine and I decided to join the RCIA in the Diocese of Arlington in Virginia. And it was halfway through, so the pastor said, even though I'd been educated in Catholic schools and seemed to know, at least intellectually, all the truths of the faith, it was better to go through the RCIA with a group to get the lived communal experience of entering the church as catechumens. And so I did that when I went to graduate school in the University of Toronto, so in Canada. And it was a wonderful RCIA program. And from there, my future godfather, who happened to be in a seminar I had in graduate school on the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, of all people, was where I met my godfather. He suggested at some point that we go to Rome during Holy Week, because the prelature of Opus Dei had a kind of a pilgrimage / conference of university students, a gathering of university students in Rome called UNIV, which took place every year. So he suggested we go to UNIV and that we try to get me baptized by the Holy Father in 1996 there. And so that's how I came into the church. My godfather was very good at convincing me this was a great thing to do, which I was a little bit incredulous that this could happen. But he convinced me that this was worthwhile. Of course, I thought it was worthwhile. I just didn't really believe it could happen. So I was baptized and confirmed and received my first communion from Pope John Paul II at St. Peter's in 1996. Came back to graduate school in Toronto for another year. Thought about my future, thought about what's next, where God was leading me. And lo and behold, the Apostolic Nuncio, the Vatican's ambassador to the United Nations in New York, happened to be giving a talk in Toronto. And he and the student chaplain decided that it would be a good idea if I went down to New York and worked for the Holy See there, partly because of my academic background, partly because my being a U.S. citizen made it easier for me than a Canadian, let's say. And, I'm sure there were some other providential reasons as well that I'm not fully aware of. And so I went to work in New York for a couple of years for the Holy See mission, the UN, which was a great experience to live in New York in the 90s and really get involved with promoting the Catholic vision of the human person and society in really the preeminent international forum that exists in the world, the United Nations. I mean, literally every country is represented there. So the role of the Holy See is one of an observer state at the UN, but it serves very much, not so much as a political player, but as a moral voice. So it tries to raise moral issues that governments might otherwise like to forget in the name of expediency or realpolitik or wherever it may be. So that was a great experience. Yeah, I mean, like I said, you get to meet people from every country of the world. Of course, they're very educated people, very sophisticated people. Some of these people didn't even know what the Holy See was. So you got to do a little bit of apostolate explaining the nature of the Catholic Church and Vatican City State and the Holy See, which of course are all distinct entities formally. And yeah, that was a fantastic experience. So after 2 years, I was thinking about, again, what's next. And at the time, Bishop Diarmaid Martin was the secretary of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, who was coming to Rome often for UN meetings, who got to know me. He knew my work, which consisted mainly of writing reports, right, of conferences and occasionally getting to speak from a written text on the Holy See's position on some issue concerning the family or parents, or it was usually something along those lines. But Bishop Martin apparently thought I would be a good fit to work for the Council for Justice and Peace. They were looking for an English speaker who had worked at the UN. And so this is very much how the Vatican works. It's an old-fashioned way of of finding people that they've worked with before. And so in 1999, I moved to Rome in September of 1999 to work for the Council for Justice and Peace, which was then headed by Cardinal Francois Xavier Nguyen Van Thuan, the quite famous Vietnamese Archbishop of Saigon, who had been taken prisoner by the Viet Cong just after the war and had come to Rome shortly after his release from prison. That was arranged with the Vatican. He was under house arrest. For viewers who know his story, it's one of very much of a saint going through suffering for Christ in Vietnam. He was the president of the council. So really, it was the greatest thrill of my time in Rome, besides getting to work for the Vatican in a formal sense, was I had the office right across the hall from Cardinal Van Thuan. So seeing who I'm convinced is a saint, right, getting to spend a professional relationship, have a personal relationship as well with this very holy man who was very normal in one sense. He had a good sense of humor, and he was very humble as well, but who had suffered so much for Jesus. To be in his midst every day in a working environment was very edifying, and could be intimidating if you thought about it too much, but he put everybody at ease. So it was very easy to be around him. And that's what I like to think of. Like to think of saints like that, right? That aren't so exalted or pious that they frighten you, but that really are approachable and that really you would like to imitate them in all ways. So I did that for 5 years, working for Council for Justice and Peace, traveling around the world, often on behalf of the Holy See, or working with bishops' conferences. When bishops come to Rome every 5 years, as they are supposed to do for their ad limina visits, going to the limits, right? Coming to visit the tomb of St. Peter and the successor of St. Peter, and really going through briefings at all the Vatican offices. I had to prepare a lot of the briefs for the meetings, bishops that came to talk about social economic issues at Justice and Peace, including the United States. The U.S. bishops come in groups. Of course, all the American bishops can't come at once. There are too many of them. So I got to know some of them during their visits to Rome. All kinds of, you meet lots of great lay people who are interested in the social teaching of the church. Again, you get to represent the Holy See at various international conferences. Really an honor.
You referenced Catholic social teaching, and obviously the purpose of your department in Rome was to promote Catholic social teaching. For those who do not know, what is Catholic social teaching?
So, Catholic social teaching, I'll go on a little bit of a rant once again here. You're asking me questions that require long answers.
That's okay. We've got all the time in the world.
So, Catholic social teaching, if we think about it in a doctrinal or modern sense, it pretty much starts in 1891 with Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, or on new things. But of course, like all things in the church, it starts with the gospel, right? With the incarnation, with Jesus. Jesus in his time on earth teaches us not only how to follow him, but how to live together. Right? The beginnings of the church are very much concerned with creating communities and societies. Catholic Church has its beginnings in time of the Roman Empire, for example, which hardly can be called Catholic or Christian. It was very ferociously anti-Christian with its kind of bloodiness and violence and all kinds of things that Christians converted ultimately through their example, through their witness, their willingness to die for the faith, first and foremost, but really by showing people how to live, how to love each other. And this is how Christianity very much spread, of course, with divine assistance and the workings of the Holy Spirit. So over time, society has changed, right? The Catholic Church has seen all kinds of regimes come and go. It's going to outlast every regime, we believe, as a matter of faith. But that doesn't mean that we should somehow be indifferent to the way society operates, right? We should, even though we know how this is going to end, right, with Christ's second coming and our ultimate redemption, we also have to work on bettering society, right? Because this is the battleground we find ourselves in. This is, the final war might be won, but the battle still take place. And Jesus very much calls us to be salt and light in the world. So Catholic social teaching has its roots, right, in the beginnings of Christianity. But in its modern form, as I mentioned with Pope Leo, it was addressing the political issues of that day, which very much, as I said, had to do with the plight of the working class, the kind of socialist, communist agitation to overthrow societies in Western Europe. The French Revolution is very much part of this background, right? The French Revolution, which looked at throne and altar arrangements, church-state arrangements that prevailed in Christendom as something that had to be overcome and destroyed in order for human liberty to expand and to grow. So the church had to, even though it's not its primary mission, right? Its primary mission has always been to the salvation of souls. It had to start thinking a little bit more seriously about these threats to its own, not just institutional well-being, right, but also the spiritual well-being of the lay faithful and all of us, really. So it had to come up with some way of thinking about these questions, right? What's called the social question in 1891 is very much directed towards how do we deal with all these working class people. So with the Industrial Revolution, people who used to live in the countryside and work jobs on farms for generations, stay close to home, attend a parish light, a nearby parish that was geographically based, marry, raise a family, die and get buried in the same town. That was starting to change with the Industrial Revolution. People moving into cities, often before they're married, single men, right, coming to work in factories in places like Manchester, England, hence the name Manchester liberalism. That's often written about in the literature of the day. That changes the way society operates. It's no longer intergenerational families staying on one plot of land for a long time and working the land. You have this new transient working class, which can be thrown out, right, of industries as they're growing. If you worked in the, for example, horse and buggy industry, when the automobile is invented, and all you can do is let's say repair and train horses, you're out of a job, right? Or your job opportunities are very much limited with technology and industrial advances. So the church is starting to think, okay, we don't have people living their lives like they used to. What are some of the principles that should inform the way we think about society? What can we do to proclaim the church's concern, not just for the working classes, of course, but for these new things that are happening? So Leo's first encyclical in 1891, as I said, Rerum Novarum, on the new thing. This new thing are the plight of the working classes, the existence of the working class. We mentioned St. Joseph before, right? St. Joseph, of course, was a worker. I mean, he was a craftsman, but he obviously lived a long time before the Industrial Revolution. He didn't collect a paycheck, right? He didn't have to worry about his working hours being set by the boss. He didn't have to worry about pensions, and these kind of things, because the world of work has changed very much since the time of St. Joseph. So with these new things happening, especially in the recently formed state of Germany, with Otto von Bismarck, the chancellor, coming up with the pension system, providing benefits to the working class, in a way also to minimize the influence of the Catholic Church, which had provided all kinds of services to the poor, the indigent. As we know, caring for widows and orphans has always been a large part of the church's ministry. With the Industrial Revolution, there are so many more poor people, right? And indigent people in cities, things that the church to some degree is overwhelmed. And so the modern state comes in and says, only we can care for these poor indigent people, right? We'll provide unemployment insurance, we'll provide pensions, we'll provide job training, all the kind of things we associate with the modern welfare state kind of come into being with Bismarck in Germany. But this is also a problem for the church, because Bismarck is doing this very much in opposition to the Catholic Church and its beliefs. So there are all kinds of things happening in the background, from the French Revolution to the Communist Revolution to Bismarckian industrialism. All kinds of things are happening in Europe that really force Leo's hand to come up with what we know as modern Catholic social doctrine, laying out some of the principles which have been developing over time.
And what are those principles, Kishore?
So some of those principles include things like the dignity of the human person. So not looking at the human being or the human person simply as a means of production, which both communists and liberals can do, right? As I mentioned before, their different visions of work can very much subject the human person to work, right? You are nothing but a cog in a machine, simply an anonymous part in the greater whole, right? Other principles of Catholic social teaching, right, that always build on human dignity, the dignity of the human person, are things like the common good, that there is a good of society that transcends all of our individual goods, that does not negate our goods, our private goods, but that allow us to live together more fruitfully and ultimately to live a more blessed and holy life. That somehow God's providence, which has not left us simply because there's been the Industrial Revolution and communism and liberalism, that God's concern for us needs to be made more manifest, let's say, in a rapidly changing, industrializing, developing society. So the common good still exists, right? And it can still be very much the focal point of what society is aiming at, what is directed towards, right? That all of us are in this together. And that principle of the common good is very much tied to the principle of solidarity, right? That, of course, there are cases where I may benefit at your expense and you may benefit at my expense. This is, of course, something the communists made a lot of hay out of. But as I said, with the common good, the idea is that we can somehow work together, right, for the mutual benefit of all. And again, that's rooted in a theological understanding of the human person, right? That God, there's a providential God who cares for us, and that if we cooperate with his grace, right, and with his will, we can all benefit from this. It's not a matter of my benefit at your expense. It's not just a dog-eat-dog, hyper-competitive world out there. That with cooperation and some understanding of human solidarity, we can come to a better, more just, more charitable society. That principle of solidarity is very much connected with the principle of subsidiarity. And subsidiarity might be a more difficult term to understand, but in a nutshell, it has to do with allowing social problems to be dealt with at the most local level possible. So in effect, that means individuals and families, right, are responsible for their own affairs, first and foremost. That no higher authority, let's call it, or more remote authority, such as the state, has the right to interfere in what can properly be done by families and individuals. And that only when those lower or closer, more local groups cannot fulfill their responsibilities should there be subsidium or assistance from higher or further away authorities. So it's a way of decentralizing political authority. It's a way of ensuring that there's human and individual freedom and initiative, right? That things are not simply done from a higher level to us, but that we participate in the development of society, that every one of us has a role to play in this, regardless of our political standing or our talents or whatever it is. And again, all these principles work together, right? If you stop and think about human dignity, the common good, solidarity, subsidiarity, these kind of four basic principles, they inform each other. And the problem often comes when we try to hold up one principle at the expense of others, or we try to, for partisan reasons or for short-sighted reasons, insist on one at the expense of the other. And we can often lose sight, right? As you can imagine, we can value, let's say, human liberty too much at the expense of human solidarity and concern for others. We can also value the collective good, the common good, at the expense of individual goods and individual rights. So there's constantly a balancing that needs to take place between these four principles of Catholic social teaching. And of course, it's not meant to be a blueprint in a kind of pragmatic or practical sense, but really a way of thinking about society. And when the church proposes these principles of Catholic social teaching, it's not trying to govern directly, right? It's not so much that the Pope or the bishop wants to say, you must listen to me because I'm God's representative. He's not speaking really on matters of faith and morals in these regards. But really, it's a form of assistance, right? It's a way of thinking through some of the problems we have in society from the perspective of faith, of course. It is the church's social doctrine, but meant in a way that the laity, as citizens, as politicians, as lawyers, as doctors, as working class people, whatever it is, that it helps us understand what a Catholic vision of society, and really what a more humane vision of society could be, if we can kind of think through these principles and let ourselves be informed by them, and act for the good of others.
So, I mean, as well as being as I mentioned, a son of Flint, from looking at your resume, you're also a bit like me, a child of the Cold War, or the latter part of the Cold War in the 1980s, and possibly ever since. There's, in the West, there's the general assumption or proposition that really we have to choose between an unbridled form of capitalism, and I speak as somebody who hails from the land of Adam Smith, and that idea that the market itself will find its own morality if left unto itself, the hidden hand. And the only, or the obvious alternative to that is state socialism as a corrective, as a counterpoint. And it seems to be that Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum and the church from there on in seem to be suspicious, critical, hostile to both of those propositions. Tell us about that.
Sure. So yes, I mean, that is a very pressing issue, because I think oftentimes we look at things in dichotomies, right? We have a dualistic way of approaching problems. We tend to look at things as either from the perspective of the individual or from the perspective of society, and not realizing how the two work together. We tend to look at things, either something has to be solved by the market or by the state. And really, that's a mistaken way of looking at things, right? Really, these things probably exist more on a continuum, or a spectrum. That on one hand, yes, you can have kind of radical individual freedom and autonomy. And on the other hand, you can have completely collectivist, totalitarian, everything is for the good of society type of societies. And really, most societies these days are somewhere between those two poles, let's call it. And Catholic social teaching doesn't presume to know what the right mixture of, let's say, individual freedom and collective decision-making should be. Circumstances kind of play a role in this. Some societies are more prone to, if you're, let's say, more homogeneous from a ethnic, racial, cultural understanding of things, it's a little bit easier to govern with some kind of a social sense, right? Because there's more agreement within society. A more pluralistic, diverse society like the United States, as we're seeing every day in the news, it's more difficult to find that kind of agreement. So you have to allow more latitude, right, for different ways of living in society. So Catholic social teaching understands that there are different types of societies. There are large countries, there are small countries, right? There are new countries, there are old countries. It doesn't try to propose a one-size-fits-all model, which is often an ideological model, right? That's what happens when people get beholden by a certain ideology or a certain fixed idea of things, is that everything must fall under this way of thinking. The church is remarkably broad-minded about in its social thought, right? It allows for these different things to take place, so long as you have a proper understanding of those principles I mentioned before, but especially of kind of the theological anthropology, right? The proper understanding of the human person. And if you understand the human person the way the church does, right, as free and responsible, but with a social nature, right, that can only be fulfilled, no human being can be saved by himself, right? We are social, political animals in the sense that we need others from the very beginning, right? Nobody creates himself. We're the product of our mothers and our fathers. We are dependent on our mothers and fathers at a very young age for several years. We cannot educate ourselves, right, in that strict sense. we have to work with others and for others to find our fulfillment. So that requires us to live in society. Living in society also means we form opinions about what is just, what is right and wrong, right? How should society be governed? These are kind of the things that make us political animals and make us care about society. And the ancient Greeks had a way of saying that the word idiot comes from the ancient Greek, and it means somebody who has no concern for public things, right? And I think the church very much shares that understanding of things, that you can't just withdraw into yourselves, no matter as an individual or even as a family, right? That your concern for society is very much part of your nature. It's something that God wants us to do, is to care for others. That includes, of course, the poor and those who are more unfortunate. The church has always, right, been very concerned with that. In fact, it was the first, right? There are the societies that would often didn't know what to do with the poor, right? If infanticide, for example, was very much a part of ancient political life. If a child was born lame or blind or handicapped or disabled in any way, right, that was it. That child was left for dead. It was Christianity and its vision, right, of the dignity of the human person, of all human beings, because they're made in the image and likeness of God, that really leads to this more caring type of society, a society that really does make room for everyone, right, regardless of their individual talents or individual capabilities. And that really is a remarkable achievement on the part of Christianity that no Christian should forget, that without Christian witness, without Christian teaching, right, we'd be left to the worst aspects of ourselves. The bloodiest, most vile, violent, terrible aspects of our human nature would be unleashed and unbridled. So the church, thank God, right, is there to remind us of these better aspects of ourselves that we very much need, because they're in keeping with God's will, right? By following God's will, following his laws, both natural and divine, that he has provided for us, he is ensuring, if not in this world, then in the next, right, our ultimate happiness, our ultimate beatitude. So this is, again, how Catholic social teaching fits with the church's evangelical mission, right? By promoting the salvific nature of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice, right, for us, his redemptive sacrifice, he shows us how to live for others, how to give ourselves to others, the gift of self, right, that Vatican II very much proposed as the kind of key to the well-being of societies and of human beings, right? To give of yourself for others is how you will find yourself. And this can only come from Christianity.
So, final question, I think most likely, Kishore. As well as the month of May marking the feast of St. Joseph the Worker, this May also marks the 130th anniversary of the publication of the aforementioned Rerum Novarum by Leo XIII. 130 years on, do you sense that the body politic, the political world, or the world of academe in the Western world and elsewhere is listening to, open to, attuned to Catholic social teaching or not? And I guess if they're not, why should they be?
So this is an easier question to answer briefly. The short answer is no. The church's Catholic social teaching is not being listened to. I can say that with near certainty. Now, some aspects of it are. Some aspects are appropriated by politicians for their own purposes, no question, right? And I think if there's a problem in our world today when it comes to politics and society, is that everyone knows we're very fragmented, right? We're very partisan. We're very much divided by whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, whether you're a right wing or a left wing, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, whatever it may be. And we tend to look at the Catholic social teaching from that political perspective. So, for example, if I am a conservative, I tend to, let's say, a more liberal type of conservative, right, in the Enlightenment sense. I tend to favor human freedom over equality and solidarity. I like subsidiarity. I like to use the principle of subsidiarity all the time, right? Leave things to the most local level possible. Don't threat on me, right? Live free or die. That kind of spirit is on one side. On the other side, if I'm a more social, democratic, left-leaning Catholic, I tend to hold up solidarity at the expense of individual freedoms and initiatives, except on sexual issues, let's say. And so as a result, you end up with people using Catholic social teaching as a club against the other side. And really what the church is proposing, right? What the church is pleading with us to do is to not look at Catholic social teaching from a political perspective, but rather to look at politics from a Catholic perspective, to try to remove ourselves to the degree that it's possible from our own partisan preferences and leanings, and try to look at things and think, right, with the church. Now, this is much easier said than done because it requires us to kind of get over ourselves, get over our own very short, narrow ways of looking at things and try to understand things from a broader perspective. That's the work of education. It's the work of formation. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. It's not necessarily based on, let's say, reading Catholic social encyclicals, which, I mean, people like myself, right, have done that for a living because we teach it, we speak on it. But really, it's something that, again, the church looks at the human person, right, as the focal point. It's in us all to understand these different aspects of social life, right? We have these seeds within us. God made us this way to be free and responsible and self-giving, right? And caring for others. He made us this way. So this is we're not fighting our natures to live this way. We just need to, again, kind of die to ourselves a little bit, right? Just like anything else in the spiritual life, you need to learn how to put yourself in second place sometimes, or third place, or the last place, to humble yourself, right? To live the life of virtue, in a nutshell, right? Which often requires things like sacrifice and some seemingly painful things to sacrifice for others and put yourself in an inferior position. But it's possible, right? I mean, that's another great thing we have with the Catholic Church. We have the Holy Spirit God does not abandon us, right, to our own devices, thankfully. He's able to guide us he speaks to us all the time, right? And we really just need to have the eyes to see and the ears to hear what God is telling us. And I think in this moment, right, there's a lot that church can teach us. Again, it's there for our benefit and for our good if we're only willing to listen.
Amen. Kishore Jayabalan, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. Have a very happy and holy feast of St. Joseph the Worker when it comes.
Thank you, David. Happy feast day to you.